Good morning, everyone. Looks like we still got some people coming in, but it's good to see everyone that is here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Staley, and I'm the Deputy Director of the long name, North Carolina Occupational Safety and Health Education and Research Center. Normally our director would have kicked us off, but with the realities of what's going on in the world, she called me yesterday. She and her partner, Jeff, have COVID, so they will be at home. But I would like to welcome you to the 5th Annual Southeast Regional Research Symposium, or SEERS as we call it, and the 12th Annual Southeastern States Occupational Network, or the SouthON meeting. So if you're unfamiliar with SEERS and the activities here, it's a collaboration between the NIOSH Education and Research Centers, or the ERCs, and agricultural centers in Kentucky, Florida, North Carolina, and Alabama. And it really is an effort to bring together emerging researchers from across the southeastern region. So it's a really nice event to share knowledge and research and things like that, and hopefully spark ideas and encourage you when you go back and as you continue with your own activities. And the goal of the SouthON annual meeting is to continue to build the annual occupational health surveillance or regional surveillance capacity and research across the southeastern U.S. region. And we know that just thinking about the realities, again, of COVID and how the workplace has changed and environment, and was already changing pre-pandemic, that this is pretty important. So the last several years, this meeting has continued to grow, really as a joint venture, but adventure too, among all of us. And so we're really delighted to have you here in Chapel Hill. And the weather's, at least it's nice today. You know, here in the South, as you know, I mean, it could be winter later today, then summer in the evening. So you never know. But we share this also with the Deep South ERC, the Sunshine ERC, the Central Appalachian Regional ERC, and then the Southeast Center for Agricultural Health and Injury Prevention, and the Southeastern Coastal Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. So we're really excited to have you here and here at the Rizzo Center if you've never been before, and we hope you'll enjoy learning with the day's activities today, as well as for those of you continuing SEERS on Tuesday and the half day on Wednesday. So we'll hear a variety of speakers and activities that hopefully you'll find really engaging as we continue. But before we kick off, just a few general announcements to be made. So all the conference sessions will be here in this room, which is the Magnolia Room, okay? And then we'll host lunch today and Tuesday in the DuBose House, which is right across the street from this building, this is Loudermilk Hall. So straight out that way, you'll see the house. Excuse me. Morning break service starts every day at 7:30 and is out in the hallway. Hopefully you saw the refreshments. And then we certainly hope that you'll join us for the welcome reception this evening. It starts at 5:30, runs till 7:30-ish, just depending how the conversation and network's going. And that'll be in the west lobby of Loudermilk, so when you walk out this door, just go all the way down to the end. That's the easiest thing to do. And there'll be hors d'oeuvres, drinks, and good conversation, good company. Now, if you're a pilot project research training presenter, if you have not sent your final presentation slides to the organizers, see Emily McCadden, which she's actually out there in the hall. She's got the blue shirt on, black skirt. And at least 45 minutes prior to your presentation, so she can make sure we have your final slides queued up, so if you haven't done that yet. And also make sure you check in for the conference at the check-in table that you saw outside there in the hallway each day that you attend, so check in each day. And reference the welcome packets to the green, or I guess teal color, folders that you have, has all your information. But if you still have questions, Feel free to ask Emily, ask Julie that's out at the table as well, and ask me. Again, I'm John Staley. So, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Terry Bunn with the University of Kentucky, who will introduce our SouthON keynote speaker.
Thanks, John. Well, I'm not going to talk about SouthON because Dr. Sanderson will be doing that after our keynote speaker. But for our keynote speaker today, for the SouthON portion of this conference, I'm very pleased to present my good friend, Governor Ernie Fletcher. He is a fighter pilot, or was a fighter pilot. He's a board-certified physician, a statesman, and a healthcare visionary. Dr. Fletcher was elected in 1998 to the first of 3 consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served as a member of the House Committee of Energy and Commerce and chaired the Policy Committee on Health Care. In 2003, he was elected the 60th governor of Kentucky, and he was very innovative in what he did as governor in regards to helping the vulnerable people of Kentucky. He was able to braid a number of different funding sources and establish what is called Recovery Kentucky Centers in Kentucky. They are 18 facilities, I believe, that are in Kentucky right now who provide that recovery housing environment to build recovery capital among people who have substance use disorders. This has been his passion for the last pretty much 20 years, I would say. And with that passion, he also established the Fletcher Group, where he continues that legacy of innovative public service dedicated to protecting and promoting the health and well-being of the vulnerable populations. Dr. Fletcher received his Bachelor of Science from the University of Kentucky in the College of Engineering, and he graduated from the University of Kentucky College of Medicine. He currently resides in Kentucky and in Georgia with his wife Glenna, and they have 2 children and 7 grandchildren. So welcome, Governor Fletcher. He's going to be speaking to us today about recovery-friendly workplaces.
I don't have any PowerPoints. We've been on Zoom for the last 2 years, and I'm PowerPointed out. So I said to Terry, let's just spend a little time talking this morning. We've got a fairly small group, so I think we can have a lot of interaction and share a few things about SUD or substance use disorder. Now, as I go along, if I use some terms that you are not familiar with, raise your hand and we'll explain them. I'm not sure how much you all are familiar with a lot of the language in addiction medicine, but I want to make sure I'm not using terms that are not familiar with you as we're going through this. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. Steve Jobs. Yes, I've made a great deal of dough from my fiction, but I never said a single word down on paper with the thought of being paid for it. I did it for the buzz. I did it for the pure joy of the thing. And if you can do it for joy, you can do it forever. Stephen King. Work is a very, very important part of our life. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of our meaning, our purpose in life. It's part of our connections with one another. Not everyone can have a job that they love, and let's be honest with ourselves. There are a lot of menial tasks that have to be done. But I do believe in every task that can find a meaning and purpose in it. Now let me talk about what's going on in the U.S. today a little bit. We could look at it. There's a lot of positive things. I'm going to look a little bit at the challenges we have. I think if you look across what's going on with our epidemics, and I'll use SUD as substance use disorder. If you look at that, the overdose deaths, over 100,000 per year now, increasing substantially. In Kentucky, we had had a period of time where we reduced the overdose deaths by about 15%. but they started increasing, and now they've increased 56% from that low rate of overdose, a relatively low rate. The increase started before COVID. 4 months before COVID, when you look at the data for the increase of overdose deaths, it started well before that March of 2020 when we began to go into taking the initiatives against COVID-19. So there was something going on before we had the sequestration, the shutdown of businesses and everything of COVID. There's no question that SUD and the impact of SUD, the risk of developing SUD is increased with isolation, loneliness. And COVID certainly, with leaving people at home by themselves, decreasing the social interaction, had an impact on connectedness, which I will talk about a bit, which subsequently increased the risk of SUD and overdose subsequent to that. I want to go through a few other deaths, so you all are all in the public health field, and I laud you for it. I think is one of the most important fields in our nation. I did have the opportunity of working a little over a year at the CDC on some projects we're doing on health and well-being in the clinic there at the CDC. And I have an utmost respect for those that work in public health, because I think it is really, if you will, it's an area that's been underfunded. And I speak as a Republican. Okay. It's underfunded. When I was in Congress, we were doubling the funding of NIH about every year or so, every couple of years. CDC never came up in the discussion. So I think public health is extremely important. And I think some of the things we're seeing is because we did not fund public health as much as we should have during that era. As I went across Kentucky when I was elected governor, I saw the health departments, a lot of them had poor facilities. They were underfunded. They were scraping to get funds. They had to reduce the services that they were providing. So I think we have some real challenges in this country. I think COVID has pointed to the challenges that we have and the lack of infrastructure within our public health to respond as strongly as we could have responded with COVID-19. I want to talk, though, a little bit in the public health, a little broader area. You may wonder, what does this have to do with SUD? Heart disease. This data I've got here is a few years old. It gets the point across, but don't look at the specific numbers. Death in heart disease, about 600,000 a year. Cancer, 580,000 a year or so, just a little less. Cerebral vascular disease, that's strokes, et cetera, 128,000 about. Alzheimer's disease, 83,000. Diabetes mellitus, 73, about 74,000. Intentional harm or suicide, the numbers there were 40,000. It's up significantly from that number, as you all know. Well, what does this have to do with SUD? All of those deaths that I talked about are related to behavior. They're related to lifestyle. Many of the, if you will, if you look at the fast food companies and the development of food, they were very focused on getting that food to the point that it was, and I'm going to use the term loosely, addictive. I bet you can't eat just one. Sugar has a tremendous impact on the same receptors that cocaine does. Oregon Health Services, or Science University, published a study a number of years ago and estimated 1.2 million people a year die from the food they eat related to their diet. What does it have to do with addiction? Addiction is part of who we are. It is part of humanity. We all have, if you will, those things that we are habitual about. Look at the social media, the literature that's about our young folks. I've got grandchildren, some that range from 3 to 23. We got a 5-year-old, if you take away his iPad, it's like I've cut off his right arm. You all know that. And his parents try to moderate how much screen time this child gets. You look at some retirees or some folks that have left Google and Facebook, and they say, no, a lot of our discussion was around is how do we promote those glutamate and dopamine receptors? How do we push those pleasure centers? Because we want people coming back. How many people post things because they want that thumbs up and liked from a number of people? Sugar is addicting. Saturated fat has addictive properties, if you will. Most of what we eat, if we look in this nation right now, are not healthy foods for us. Dr. Katz at the University of Yale and the College of Public Health estimates that probably up to 70 or 80% of the diseases that we have are preventable by changes in lifestyle. So what I'm trying to say is we all have behavioral issues that impact our life. SUD is another one of those. And the other thing I want to point out is that sometimes the perfect can hold up the good. Drug-free schools, drug-free workplaces. Is that possible? Are we striving for something that's not possible and focusing on trying to eliminate a substance rather than manage addiction and a substance? Just a way of looking at it. It's subtle, but it impacts how you deal with individuals that have SUD. But let's get back to some of the numbers. And you all probably know the impact of SUD, so I don't want to go through a lot of those, but I want to talk some specifically on the fact that we find that if you look at our workforce needs in SUD, what is reducing the availability of workforce at this time? 20 million people in our nation have SUD. 70% of them work. That means for those employees that say, I don't want to hire those people, they are already hiring those people. Individuals using drugs are in the workforce right now. And yet most employers don't have a program or a system or a culture to deal with folks with SUD. What about the health equity aspect of it? The war on drugs, and I was a big supporter of a war on drugs. We were sending $1 billion to Colombia to fight FARC to reduce the cocaine that was coming in when I was in Congress. We thought we were doing a good thing. Not that that's a bad thing, but we thought the war on drugs was what we needed to do to stop the cocaine that was flowing into this country at that time. And that was before the opioid epidemic. Well, what did the war on drugs do? I'm not saying all of it was bad, but what did it do? First off, we have the fact that it impacted those people of color much more than others, extensively. 62% of drug offenders admitted to prisons are blacks or African Americans. Black men are sent to prison, drug charges 13 times the rate of white individuals. 2 out of 5 blacks sent to prison are convicted of drug offenses, compared to 1 in 4. And let me say this, it appears the incidence of drug use is the same in whites and blacks. So you've got to look at that as the baseline when you look at the number of arrests, the arrest rates, et cetera, compared to the incidence. Black men are incarcerated 9.6 times the rate of white men in 11 states. And a lot of those are in the states you all are working in. 20 black men over the age of 18 are in prison. Only 1 in every 20 black men over the age of 18 in the United States, or 1 of every 20 is in a state or federal prison, to compare 1 in 180. Fact is, there's a tremendous amount of inequity that came out of the war on drugs. What does that mean? That means there's hundreds of thousands of individuals that have been incarcerated that are left their life and an albatross around their neck called a felony charge. Interesting, I was talking to an individual in our work as we developed the Fletcher Group, and we work in about 30 states under a HRSA grant. help promote recovery ecosystems. Let me bring up a little, and to develop recovery housing. Individual was a very wealthy real estate developer. He was in Nashville. He said, I can go into any apartment complex in Nashville and buy it. He said, but I cannot go into that same apartment complex and rent an apartment because I've got a felony charge due to a federal drug charge that I had years ago. Many workplaces don't consider those individuals that have felony charges. So we take and lock up a large number of people of color, and then as they re-enter into society, they can't find a place to live, they can't get employment, and we wonder why our recidivism rate is high. What does work have to do with it? Let me talk just a little bit about recovery capital. We put it in kind of an economic terms because recovery capital is that measurement of how much capital does an individual have in the way of resilience to reduce reuse. It has a lot to do with things. If you have a loving family and you're connected to them, or if you have a spouse or a significant other that you're connected to, that's recovery capital. You have a support system around you. If you have a car and you can get to work, or you have a job, is an extremely important part of recovery capital. That's recovery capital. If you have a place to live, if you're living under a bridge, which a number of folks with SUD are, it's one of the larger causes of homelessness. You don't have a job, you don't have a place to live, your family may have given up on you. Whether or not you're using drugs is really not a major concern of yours that day. In fact, an escape from reality is probably a choice that seems very reasonable to you at that point. So recovery capital is that concept of developing a level of measurable resiliency and reducing your risk of relapse, or reuse as we call it. SUD increases about 4.1 times in young adults' life after 6 months of unemployment. So here's where I want to talk a little bit about employment and SUD. If a young individual is unemployed, they have 4 times the risk of developing substance use disorder than a cohort that's employed. So work has a significant impact on the risk of SUD. And I think it's extremely important to realize that if we can increase the number of what we call second chance employers, some call, but basically it's employers that have established a recovery-friendly workplace. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. There's also evidence, and not only does work give meaning and purpose, there's also some real neurological evidence that it has a healing impact on the brain. There's some research going on that employment helps the prefrontal cortex affected by SUD via reversal learning. In general, jobs that offer an individual some job control or autonomy and physicality, they're more likely to support recovery and the healing in the neurologically those with SUD. In fact, the other important part of it is upward mobility. Makes sense. I've got something where I can make my own choices. I'm physically active, which is always helpful. And I've got hope that I'm not going to be just doing this menial task now, but it's going to lead to something better. How many of y'all are students? You're a student, why? Because of hope of being able to attain to a higher level in your academic profession or whatever you end up going to. But it's that hope of something better that makes you sit and do all the work that you're doing in your school. Well, it's the same thing. And I want you to understand when you're looking at workforce issues, injuries, whatever, I want you to think about looking at work as meaning, purpose, and therapeutic. We don't think of jobs as being therapeutic, but obviously you said they reduce the risk of SUD, and not only that, promote healing. Let me give you an example. We have a gal named Lori Bear. Terry knows her, and I want to say, Terry, thanks. We get the opportunity to work on a HRSA grant together as co-PI on that grant, and really been able to learn a lot together, I will say, in this. Lori Bear is our Director of Workforce Initiatives. We're about recovery housing. What does workforce initiatives have to do with recovery? I've shared that a little bit. But what she has done is been able to take folks that are in recovery, test them, look at their skills, their aptitude, and interest. Stephen King, you want a job you love. You're going to be successful, you got to do something you like. She's been able to transition about 300 individuals over the last couple of years into meaningful employment, help them build that recovery capital. One program she helped build and it started was Tailor-Made Farms. You know, the folks that make the golf clubs also own horse farms. They're there in Kentucky. She started the Elite Equine program. And it's, you start off at the very bottom on a horse farm. You start off grooming horses. You kind of get close to them. You have to muck their stalls. It's not a great job from that standpoint, but it has some autonomy. It has some physicality to it. And not only that, but when you hear, and there was a video produced by it, when you hear their testimonies, they talk about the relationship with the horses and the therapeutic effect of that. And they talked about the fact that they have meaning and purpose and they're making a difference. And they also have hope. They're on a track to become a farm manager, maybe a trainer. It works. And Frank Taylor, who really helped set this up and run it for Tailor-Made Farms, we're very passionate about for a couple of reasons. One, they can't get workers. Simple economics of it. I need somebody to make sure their horses are groomed. And two, he had a real compassion for those individuals and believe they can turn their lives around. That's what we need in our workplaces in this nation. And you all are critical for that. And I want you to think as you're looking, and I know some of you are looking at reducing injuries and things, and people with SUD, and a good portion of them are in the workforce now, are 3 times likely to have a workforce injury than folks without it. So it does impact directly the work that you're doing in that area as well. What would a place look like? Well, we have EAP, employee assistance programs, but most employers don't have what we call a recovery support services. What are those? Well, first of all, culture. Culture, and you'll read this in business management articles and books. Culture trumps strategy in a business. You can have all the strategy and tactical planning that you want. If you don't have the right culture, none of that will make a difference. So first off is developing a culture that turns from punitive to restorative. So that you've got a culture that's looking like that we're here, that if you have a problem, we're here, we provide the support services around you. We're here to help rebuild your life, to help you overcome the challenges you had, knowing, as I said at first, we all have to deal with some sort of addiction. It's a part of who we are. You may not leave believing that. And I think as you get to life and see that with your loved ones, I think you'll come to understand that. There's a good book I was telling Terry about that. It's called The Urge. And it's a psychiatrist that wrote about his life experiences and really covers the history of SUD very well in treatment and really comes to that conclusion. We all deal with those habits, some good, some bad. There are some folks that write, choose your addiction. It's not that you're not going to have one, just choose the good ones. Drug testing. It's important for accountability. And I think when you look at providing recovery support services, you end up having to have those supportive services, but there's a degree of accountability too. And it helps, it's important. When I was reading the book, The Urge, it reminded me because I'd worked with some individuals in what we call impaired physician program. Probably not perfect, but it's not a bad model to start looking at. And the fact that If a physician is found to be using drugs or have SUD, they give them the opportunity to go into a paired physician program. The other opportunity is go before the licensure board and probably lose your license. So there's a good degree of accountability there. But once they get in there, they provide the support services. They have sponsors. I had an individual we hired who had an issue with that. I had to write reports every couple of weeks back to the board of the impaired physician program. It worked very effectively. Extra Surge does too. But think of that, and I want you to think of a workplace where there's support services for the folks with SUD. There's also some accountability. What we've proposed and are doing some is if you have a third party that's out there, and I think this is an excellent opportunity for people that want to develop some business around this area, is to provide a staffing service or wraparound services to help businesses, especially small businesses that may not have the capital to invest in providing recovery support services. It also keeps it out of the employer and a third party so you don't have to deal with the HIPAA issues and some of the other things. But that allows you to provide those wraparound services, recovery support services, peer support services, drug testing for accountability, making sure individuals go to their groups. And it may be groups at AA that's evidence-based or something called Smart Recovery that's, I would say, takes away that spiritual aspect and is more around cognitive behavioral therapy. But there's many of options out there for peer support of working with those that have lived experience and understand where you've been and where you're going. Also, the fact that the individuals can provide clinical access. I want to talk just a little bit about medication-assisted treatment, because I think one of the problems we have in addressing this epidemic is, I'll call it biological reductionism. I think we see sometimes as the biology of this and that a medication will change that biology alone. I'm a physician, I'm waived to write Suboxone or buprenorphine, and I think it's important, it's very important, and it works for a number of people alone. But when you start working with the folks in the criminal justice system, with the folks that have had their families broken up and destroyed, when you look at the folks that have been homeless or some of the other populations that have extremely difficult challenges, they need a lot more of those social determinants addressed than just medication. And most of the funding that we've seen at the federal level goes toward harm reduction, which I support thoroughly, and medication. But only now are we starting to look at some support for recovery support services and support in the workplace for those with SUD. So I think that's extremely important. A lot of young faces out here. I hope you all can change that and change the approach. I will use the term full continuum of care. I think that's extremely important. There are some studies that show MAT alone works as well as those that may have some counseling with them. But when you're looking at those challenging situations that I've talked about, it's probably more important to make sure that you have that full continuum of care. We provide recovery housing, or we don't do it. Personally, we have to help build it. When we built Recovery Kentucky, we did that. It takes 9, 12 months, even longer, to heal the neurological impact of SUD. 30-day programs work. People that go through a lot of those usually end up going through about 8 times. If you can start extending that care out to 9 or 12 months, you start getting a little more healing. You can start incorporating workforce planning, development, career planning. You can start building that recovery capital with that individual that addresses the social drivers. So what are the important elements? I've mentioned a number of them in work. One is attitudes, and I think stigma is a big part of that. The reason I wanted to talk about I'll just say we all are subject to some sort of addiction. I use that term, and I know we try to use our proper terminology, but from a medical standpoint, it addresses it. So we can understand that we reach out and have compassion with those individuals. And we're doing a lot of work on stigma, and Terry knows that with some of her staff. We've done some surveying, national surveying, to look at stigma. But I had this one experience I just want to share with you that helped me understand a little more of what people's background are in stigma. It was a friend of ours, a very successful couple. I was talking with her about the work we're doing, and she said, my father was an alcoholic. I'll use the terminology. She said, my father was an alcoholic. So he always promised to do better. He never did. He never, abusive family and things, and she said, I'll never trust those people. And you look at the trauma that she's gone through and that, we can start to understand some of the sources of stigma. If you're a spouse that experienced some abuse from somebody that was high on drugs or something, you may have a problem with individuals with SUD as well. Stigma is extremely important. We don't need to look at individuals that have that without understanding sometimes the source of where they're coming from. But stigma in the workplace is something that must be addressed. And I think talking about addiction as a complex disease, more than just a biological disease, it has to do, and clearly those with ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, the more they've had, the more increased risk they have of SUD. So it's a complex disease. It has to do with not only probably genetics, but probably a larger part of it is the environment we've been in. A lot of it is experience as a child. So understanding the stigma, there are some programs, educational programs, and I think in the workforce, beginning to have those programs and understand most people now have had experiences in their family or friends with the prevalence of SUD. They've either had deaths, they know in their family, or somebody that's been affected by it. So it's no longer them, but it's us. But overcoming stigma is extremely important in encouraging folks to get the kind of help they need. I think the workplace, a culture that's inspirational. That means there's hope. That means you have career pathways. That means you have meaning and purpose in them. A positive atmosphere versus negative. It's all simple stuff. You all know that. Nobody wants to work in an atmosphere that is punitive, that is negative. And I think if we can start looking at the individual with SUD differently, I think we can start saying, let's promote the restoration. Let's help them build recovery capital. Interesting, there's an individual that runs a restaurant called Deviate in Lexington, Kentucky, and he's done, it's not a scientific study, but from his perspective, he opened it up to support people in recovery. And he found out they're better workers, they're more productive than the average individual that comes off the street. He has a contract he signs with them. He said, look, you've got to go to a support group, whether it's AA or Smart Recovery or some other program, but you've got to go regularly to that. That's part of it. There are drug tests that you need to take and accountability. But he supports them well and finds out it's really that those workers are very good. We can just talk a little bit about some of the personalities that are looked, and there's really not a good, there's been a lot of research on individuals' personalities and other things that would lead to a prediction that somebody is at a higher risk of SUD. There's some implications, but it's not real clear. But one of the things is that those individuals are often risk takers. Risk takers make very creative people. They're not afraid to do things. And I think some of you find out those folks with SUD, when you have to build recovery capital, they can be some of your most creative workers. Whatever, they deserve a chance. They can contribute substantially. And I think some of the things that we need to do in this country is to look at who we're locking up, why we're locking them up, what that's done to our workforce from an economic standpoint. We've taken a lot of people out of the workforce and locked them up for possession of small amounts of drugs. Oregon is starting to look at the decriminalization of possession of small amounts of drugs. And actually, we're working, Terry, as you know, to do some research on the impact of that, impact on stigma, access to care, second chance employment. And I think it's something that we need to do in this country is to look at decriminalizing SUD. If we start doing that, there are literally thousands of people that now can be available for building recovery capital and into the workforce and changing, I think, the overdose deaths substantially. The other thing I think is that we're starting to look at, as I mentioned before, the full continuum of care. And part of that is a recovery ecosystem. We're doing also a study with NORC, which is an organization affiliated with the University of Chicago out of DC and East Tennessee State University on developing a recovery ecosystem index. It's population health. I hope some of y'all would be interested in that. Let me give you an example. We went into a small town, Middlesboro, Kentucky, Bell County. 10 years ago, it had 35,000 people. Now it has 25,000 people. Have a real issue with SUD, some of the higher risk, higher overdose rates, high levels, fairly high levels of poverty. It's a beautiful area. If you ever come through the Cumberland Gap, you're right there. That's where it is. That's where most of the folks that settled, the Daniel Boones of the past, came through that gap. So it's got a beautiful area, very historical prominence. So we brought the community together. We wanted to develop a recovery ecosystem. It started off with the president of the community college was very interested in doing something with SUD. He was doing it because he felt like he could recruit a lot more students to his school, his university, or his college there. The healthcare system, the local elected officials, the housing authorities. Start bringing in jailer, the executives of the county. You start bringing in workforce development. We brought all those together and we say, first off, what's being done in the community and how can we engage those? And then secondly, what are the needs of the community and assessment? And then you go into, let's bring those individuals together and let's look at what we can do to develop a recovery ecosystem here. What they wanted there was they felt like that there was no facilities to help pregnant and parenting women. So we set out to develop in this community a center that would provide a full continuum of care for pregnant and parenting women. It's a small community. We ended up with what we've done, and we accessed low-income housing tax credits out of HUD to help support it. Federal Home Saving Bank grants, which often go with what we call LIHTC, provide that. We got someone to donate half the land. They end up bringing together the criminal justice system, drug courts, that were willing to refer those folks, those individuals, those ladies that have been charged with some sort of drug offense. And by the way, 60% of the folks that are incarcerated have a clinical diagnosis of SUD, and 80% have some sort of substance involved in what they're doing. So we brought the criminal justice system in for referral. We set up intensive outpatient, a planned strategy. We're breaking ground on it this summer. But it ends up being over a $13 million project in a small community. And we're able to do that to bring it together. We had some opposition. There was some stigma in the community. In fact, we did another project in Eastern Oregon, and some folks came out and just stopped one of our projects because there were really some very, I would say, almost violent opposition to what we were doing. So it's important in a community to really address the recovery ecosystem is to address the stigma that NIMBY, not in my backyard. But it's possible to do that when you bring it together. We had some opposition, but we got with the newspaper, we got the right articles read, we had the public officials come out speaking, and we were able to overcome that. But what we need in the nation, I think another challenge or opportunity really for you all is, as you're looking at the workforce, that's a very important part of this recovery ecosystem. It's probably one of the most significant aspects of recovery capital for an individual that has other treatment modalities on board. Summary, we have a source of more workers. They can be the most productive and creative workers in our workforce. Who wins? Employers. More workers. Better culture in their workplace. Safer workplaces. More recovery capital. More resilient employees. More connections. Connections. If there's a thread, and there's a researcher in Ireland named David Best and John Kelly out of the Recovery Research Institute out of Boston, both will look, and the studies talk about connection as being the important thread that goes through recovery. And work is a very important part of that. You're probably familiar with, if you're not, I encourage you to be familiar with a longitudinal study that was begun back in the 30s at Harvard. They started, it was men only, but at that time, Harvard was a men's school, and a portion of it. And they tracked those longitudinal studies until now. There's a guy named Dr. Valiant that wrote a lot on it, and then he's no longer studying, and I think it's Dr. Wiglin is doing it now. But what they found, and let me read this because I think it's an important part of understanding why workplaces is so important. Let's see if I can find a quote. This is a quote from the head of the research project, the Harvard longitudinal study. Close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives. The study revealed those ties protect people from life's discontents, help to delay mental and physical decline, and are better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, and even genes. Having what Valiant did, in one of his articles said that basically what I will call loving connections and relationships, and he referred to it as that, is the single most important thing in our health and well-being. And the workplace is an extremely important place for building those connections. Be glad to take some questions, comments. Yes?
Well, first off, that was really interesting. You talked a bit about drug testing and accessibility, and I'm really not familiar with the research on that. And I was wondering, well, A, if these drug tests are primarily voluntary from patients, even if not, does this have any adverse effect on perhaps the trust between the patient and the care team or the community?
That's a good question. I don't know I don't know the answer, but let's talk about drug testing. I mean, I think that's an important thing. I think part of it is, and when you look at an individual with SUD that I will say is in the depths of their disease, part of it looks that the disconnect and the aberration in the prefrontal cortex and down in the other areas has an impact. The individual can no longer really make decisions based on outcomes, the urge, the drive, and everything is like that. So, that's why I think it's important to read some of the experiences of these individuals. They need the accountability. And that's a very important part. Now, drug testing is part of that accountability. As some write that said, I knew I was going to have to take that drug test, and my job or my license or whatever depended on it. That was an important part. As far as studies looking at the negative impact on that, I honestly don't know any, but that's a legitimate concern, or you're bringing up a legitimate issue. I think the fact of random drug testing, which it was done in a number of workplaces. I think that probably would be a place where there is a more negative impact on culture than on saying that in a care plan, if you will, for an individual that has a diagnosis of SUD, as part of that care plan is regular drug tests. I mean, if you're prescribing MAT, it's generally required. It's part of making sure two things. One, they're complying and taking their medication and not diverting it. And two, that they're not using other substances. Because you can't really intervene if you don't know that. So it cuts both ways. Any other thoughts on, maybe you've got some folks that are. I do think culture can overcome that if folks know that if you've got a positive drug test, and I think this is more important than drug tests, if you have a positive, of course, and we understand the natural history of the disease is people will reuse. That is part of the history. And rather than looking at that a drug test means that you're fired, a positive drug test means that they end up getting more support services and the opportunity to turn around. And so if you look at it from that standpoint, it probably takes away some of the negative impact of that. So just a thought. Yeah.
What studies have been done? What studies have been conducted proving the relationships between SUD and creativity? Like, what were the major conclusions or data? What did you get from that?
You know, I drew a. I connected some dots there on the fact that there are some. If you look at individuals with SUD, sometimes are more risk takers. More risk takers tend to be a little more creative. They're willing to, go outside the lines. I don't know, and Terry, I don't know if you know of a study directly looking at creativity, how it would be measured, and that. I think that's, it comes from probably a lot of things, like a lot of your musicians were involved in heroin. If you look at Sonny Rollins, Charlie Parker, a lot of your jazz community there, those were heroin, and they felt like it released them and allowed them to be more creative. That's true in a lot of the arts, it was. But I don't know that a study that looks and defines how they define creativity. So yeah. Yeah.
If you could use the microphone, please.
Sorry about that. Just one quick question for the recovery capital and employment, where we kind of discussed a little bit about employees typically not relapsing or finding support through their employment. Was that typically found with higher level employments where, managers and business owners are offering that level of support, or is that just employment in general? So, for instance, if we were to take like a worker at like a fast food restaurant versus like an office job or maybe something that needed a little bit more experience, would you find that any difference between the recovery capital there, or is it kind of?
When you look at some of the measures and the things you look at, as I recall, I don't think there's a distinction between the level of, say, the professional level of the employment. I do think there's, historically, when you look at the workplace, those up in management, and I'll take, I spent a number of years in the Air Force, and they had programs. We had Golden Flow back then. I don't know, that's probably before your time, but it was a drug effort at that time to clear the military. This was back in the 80s. And the random drug test for folks. But it was we were flying and probably, flying, it was a Cold War, so they didn't want folks flying around that were having drugs, shooting down Soviet airplanes. So anyway, it was a little different culture. But what we had there, though, there was a program there that you could go in and get help for and alcohol is still the elephant in the room, by the way. I mean, there's 95,000 deaths a year from alcohol, 105 overdose deaths, but not 95,000 of opioids. It's probably about 2/3 to 3/4 of the 105,000. I do think there's a difference, and I think you have to, but we've had some discussions with some fast food restaurant owners. They have a real difficulty in getting workers. And we talked to them about, is this a dead-end job? And a lot of them try to get to your question there is the fact that if they can invest a little more in that, Tom Snyder, that owns, 20 McDonald's in Kentucky, said his turnover rate is 110% a year. He spends a lot of money on training. He gets folks that in there that, it takes a while to learn what you're doing. He could have a program where we bring some folks in. I didn't talk about career pathways, but when I was talking about the peer support services, I think having there an individual, a peer, to help an individual develop a career pathway. And if it's McDonald's, it might be flipping burgers at first, but there is a pathway there to become a manager, a store manager, a regional management, and looking at giving that hope. So I think it's important there. Obviously, your executive levels, there's probably more leniency there, more understanding from, the colleagues and things. And so there's going to be that inequity, and I don't know that we'll be able to resolve that, but I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Hi. So this might be part of the group because we're all occupationally oriented, but for communities that don't have those job opportunities, besides what you're doing in Middlesboro, have you guys thought about ways to bring in like local public health departments or different community resources that are not tied to an occupation to help folks who are suffering from this disorder?
It was a real faux pas for me not to mention the local health department and part of the recovery ecosystem. It's very important, and I've helped. I'm very supportive of local health departments and build that. But let me give you a little experience. We were working with ASHTO and NACHO. I don't know if y'all are familiar with those, the public health officers and local health department of national associations. And we were in a town in southeast Ohio, in the Appalachia region, Ohio. And we began to talk to the health department there because they were going to be a very integral part. And the physician that was the medical director for the health department, very interested in developing some recovery support services, recovery housing. COVID hits. And we had this we met with a group of local health departments, and they said, we don't have the bandwidth to deal with it. We can't even deal with COVID right now. And that's where I was talking about the lack of funding on public health, that they really didn't have the resources. But I really would encourage health departments, and we do. We have a whole gal that's, part of her job is to work with NACHO, the National Association for City and County Health Officials or something. Yeah, I think that's it. But I think it's a very important role. I think the health departments can step up and take a leadership role even in developing those recovery ecosystems. I encourage you to do that or think about it.
Dr. Fletcher, thank you so much for coming. This is Andy Kane from the Southeastern Coastal Ag Center at University of Florida. I got some new vocabulary out of you, and thank you so much for all of it. So I really liked recovery ecosystem, but the one that stuck with me mostly, I think, was culture trumps strategy. And I think what we're all taught, as public health professionals, and really the range of who we all are, and that we all wear multiple hats as you do, it's very hard to jump the culture chasm unless you are actually fully engaged that way. And so I'm hearing you as sort of an advocate for humanity. You're trying to change the culture of the way we see SUDs and people who struggle with SUDs in society, in the workplace, And for us as public health professionals spanning all of these different micro sectors and all the different experiences and capacity that we have, to be advocates, to be able to move the needle just a little bit here. How do we make stronger leadership happen in the workplace, to make that workplace where there is a sense of place and hope and joy and engagement and ownership and all of the things that make the concept of prosperity, that come from belonging, right? It's belonging to family, it's engagement, it's belonging, it's a sense of self in the world around you. How can we as public health professionals start engaging to address leadership? Because leadership in business doesn't mean you can be brilliant economically, you can be brilliant in terms of making lots of money, but it doesn't mean you're a good boss. As a matter of fact, they make oftentimes really bad bosses. And so I'm just curious as to what you think we can do. Give us some homework to think about. And then the other part is, how do we do the same kind of thing to move policy, the needle on policy a little bit, where the obstacles against partisan issues are seemingly insurmountable, and we're very poorly trained in that arena as well?
Tough questions. Let's talk about, first off, there's a lot of young faces here, which is good. When I started to give a talk, I really look, and I think this comes from the political world, I'm not as interested, and this may sound bad, but I'm not as interested in what I imparted to you from knowledges here, is what do you feel when you leave? Are you inspired? The knowledge is important, but people don't act as much on knowledge as they do on that feel, that passion that's developed. So I hope from this, there is some passion that started, ignited in these young faces and older ones too, to at least realize there's an opportunity out here for you to change our nation. And change it, maybe in a small area you're working in, but change it significantly. I think part of it is you've got to have a seat at the table. That is important. There's somebody that told me something that I've always remembered, and it's a significant portion. When I was in Congress, there was a guy, he was a Christian guy out of Oxford, Os Guinness, and he would have a lunch occasionally, and I'd go to that lunch. And he said, the most significant power you have here as a member of Congress is the power to convene. And that people would answer my phone calls. If I asked to meet somebody, they would actually meet me. Even as governor, I had a stronger power to convene. I will warn you, there's one day between who's who and who's he. But as you leave that, but you do have the power to convene. And I think it's important to think about who's involved in workforce development. What about the Chamber of Commerce? And the reason I say that is because we in Kentucky have the State Chamber of Commerce brought together a group of folks. And I'll have to say right now, it just occurs to me the health departments were not part of that group. But to reach out to those, because why? Employers have a need. They're looking for folks to work. A friend of mine who I just talked to was executive director of the National Association of Manufacturers previously. They have hundreds of thousands of jobs in manufacturing that they cannot fill. So I think you're addressing that leadership and say, we have an opportunity to meet your economic and workforce needs. Let's start working together and looking at this a different way. So I think getting a seat at the table and start looking at what can I do with the Chamber of Commerce locally? What can I do with, there's workforce development entities in your communities. And throughout rural America, there are some of those that are, there are those. We work with something called EK-SEPT, it's Eastern Kentucky Employment Program. And that's who we worked with. They have funding for taking individuals and paying for individuals going into workplace, and they'll fund the first few months of employment there. So there's a lot of opportunities to do that. When we get into the leadership, I think begin to talk about it. Begin to engage those leadership in businesses and talk about talk about SUD, the workforce and recovery ecosystem, recovery capital. But I envision the health department that can be really a nidus for change in communities, of changing that culture of the community in the workplace. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It does. I just think it answers the question. I'm also looking for linkages. I mean, one of the things about this conference that is unique is it brings together people from throughout a region at these different extramural NIOSH centers, but it also convenes epidemiologists and folks from the SouthON group, and that includes, obviously, departments of health. And so we're trying to make merry with the bigger group because those types of synergy and collaborations provide the joint leadership that together, we have that collective capacity.
Yeah. What occurs to me too is there's a great opportunity across this of collaboration. There's a lot of opportunity for research in this area too, I think. And a lot of you have connections, with NIOSH, with CDC. I'd worked with NIOSH a little bit when I was at the CDC, but I think part of that is broadening their focus on workforce injuries and workforce safety, and looking at SUD as an integral part of that effort, and looking at recovery-friendly workplaces as a way of reducing injury, maybe a way that I've kind of implied here. So you probably have some more thoughts. We'd love to hear anything else you have.
I'd love to actually hear more questions from.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. So good morning. The lack of holistic approach, from what I've seen, seems to be a major barrier to a lot of different of the successes, progresses that have been made. So one example is lack of bail reform, which leads into how are we treating different populations equitably? But then that leads into, we have somebody arrested, they go through the court system, they have child support issues, they're not making money while they're incarcerated, they get out, they have no rights to a driver's license because they're behind on the child support, which then when they get a job, they have wage garnishment until they can meet the needs to get their driver's license back to even get to work, but they're not making enough money to survive. And then from the employer side, why would we as safety people take on a known risk to others? We are by OSHA compelled to eliminate all known hazards and risks, and yet we have an employee who either by state law we're able to do a drug test, or Oregon where we may not be able to do one. We find out they're positive, we have a known risk. Why would we as an employer take that on when we have the punitive systems of MSHA and OSHA who can come down on us from a workplace safety aspect, because we have somebody who might cause an accident or get injured, but the employer was just trying to do the right thing or be nice. So the lack of holistic approach here from, like I said, all the way from bail reform to OSHA and MSHA, how do we solve this? It seems like there needs to be a federal trickle-down effect versus a state grassroots system where all these little ideas are coming out, but there's no collegiality or no cohesiveness to it.
Yeah.
Not really a question.
Get back to your question. I didn't answer on public policy, kind of the impact. How do you impact that? And I think, coming from the grassroots and being there, willing to look collectively, I think you can have a much larger impact on Congress and the policy that's going on there. And I think you need to look at that. And my year at the CDC, well, let me give you this, and I'm going to use the CDC as an example. And I've told them this, and I worked with Ann Shuckett there and things, and said, look, they do absolutely, and I was just say, a miserable job of government relations. Now, they've got an office there, and there's probably somebody there that's very good, and I don't want to impugn them. But I was in Congress for 5 years. I had to leave early to take the office of governor in my last term. Nobody from the CDC ever visited me, not one person. Now, I wasn't chair of a committee, so maybe they were visiting that. I got a lot of input from NIH. I got a lot of input from GE that wanted to develop more plants in China. I got visits from everybody that wanted things from, farmers to people that didn't want, big trucks on the roads. Never anybody from CDC. So I had no idea of what you did. NIOSH, not really anything from there. So you gotta be heard. You gotta have a seat at the table. And it may be something, I think part of it is when you have so much that you have responsible for now, sometimes it's difficult to step back and say, can I take on some more responsibility? And that's why I look at the young faces out here and think, surely you all can do it better. I mean, you've got some real opportunities. I think it's exciting to be in your seat because there's so many opportunities you have to really transform lives, and that's what it's about. It's changing the life of others, and that's part of that connectedness that we're talking about. But I think it is important to look and to point out. I think research, looking at those things, it's not easy when you look at an individual. But I've already said you've got folks there that have SUD that have 3 times the risk of accidents of individuals that not. So the risk is there. And I think having a program that when you identify somebody like that, you have a restorative approach and a supportive approach versus a punitive approach, that you can turn that individual around. And I think it'll make the workforce safer. We were working with the hospital, Pikeville Medical Center, and they needed environmental safety workers. And basically, those are folks that it sounds good. You might think, well, at first I didn't know what it was, but they go in and make sure the ORs are clean and everything. But they can't get enough of them, and the turnover's huge. So we were putting together a program, and there is a guy now that's doing it from a recovery place there to help get them trained. And there's a certification for it. So we're working with the community college to get certifications at the end. Well, if you don't have enough of those, your ORs are dirty, your rooms are not cleaned properly, everything, there's a big risk of that. So there's also a big risk of not having adequate individuals in there. So by reducing the workforce in some of those roles, you're actually kind of making it a little less safe. So it's not as simple as you, I mean, you know that. Any other questions?
Sorry, can I just
Yeah.
add to what because you bring up a very good point. Remember, for all employers.
Terry, get a microphone here.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Individuals with substance use disorders are protected under ADA. So they are a protected population. So by not hiring them, you could also get in trouble. Just want to point that out.
Very good point. Here, you can give that to Dr. Kane here.
One more.
We still have time? Okay, I'll try and make it quick. Your answer to that question just made me change my question to a comment and a question. First of all, Congress has changed. You have 6 centers represented in this meeting, and we visit Congress every year. Good. And we give you, we always spend a little time with the staffers. We don't actually meet with the senators and the congressmen. But in the Kentucky delegation, we go to visit every office, with the exception of one who's kind of a nutcase, and you can probably guess who that is. But we don't bother to go to that office. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know that at least we're doing our due diligence to show up on Capitol Hill, at least virtually the last couple of years, but in person before that. My question is this, and you talked about culture a good bit. In all honesty, our center hasn't had much of a focus on this. I know Dr. Bunn has a strong focus on this, and she's a good partner, but it's one of the things we'll be discussing in our staff meetings. But I want to get to my question on culture. Working with some of the shelters there in Lexington, I've seen a mixed bag. I've seen people who've gotten hired and gone on and done fabulous. I've seen people who just don't make it. They don't cut it. The difference seems to be, innate a little bit, but also culture. They tend to be one of 2 people who have a criminal record who are working in that workplace. I don't know if you're familiar with a restaurant chain in Columbus, Ohio called Ma's Chicken. You ever heard of Ma? She's deceased now. But Ma created this restaurant chain where she only hires people with a criminal record. And almost all of them, and of course it's restaurant work, but at least they show they can show up for work. that they do good work, they provide good service, and then many of them go on and get other jobs. And if you just a shout out to Moz, this is the best chicken I've ever eaten. You can only get chicken, but it has really been so it's a culture where everybody comes from. Now they're not all substance abuse. It could be any number of reasons, but they all have a criminal record. And anyway, I wondered if that would have any difference in the mutual support they would get in that kind of situation.
I think those kind of, interesting enough, those kind of stories tend to have a bigger impact than actually research data on public officials. They can relate to it and things. And I think that's just I think it's an extremely good example of what can happen. And I don't, to answer your question of who's going to succeed and who's failed, and that really wasn't your question, but pointing out some of those things, I think it's difficult, but the turnover rate now in work is pretty high anyway. And so I think the more work we can do and the more work you all can do in helping establish programs, support services, and maybe even ability to identify those folks that have less resilience or less recovery capital is important. I don't know that we'll ever be able to predict that, but I think we have a great opportunity out there. I look at all these folks with substance use disorder, how many people we've locked up. It's a travesty in this nation. And I think you all have a real opportunity to help change that. It's going to have to change public policy, but I think the Moz Chicken and places like that can help turn that around. I'm going to end with just one story. And I'm sorry I didn't plan on telling this, so I didn't check his name. About 3 years ago, I talked to an individual. We were looking at the staffing model, and there's a guy that's a second chance employer down in Atlanta. He runs a staffing agency. Big black guy that runs this. He had come out of prison. And he runs this, and he tells a story. He said, I had a young guy come in, a black guy come out of prison.
Hello. Hold on one second. Let me get my video working. Hold on a minute. There we are. Hi. Hello.
Anyway, the story is he comes in, he had a gun and said, I'm going to have to go out and do what I've got to do. He said, I can't get a job. I can't get anything at a job. So he said, hold on, sit there. And he called up. He's got a network of employers he works with. And he said, look, I've gotten you a job and go out. He said the guy came back 2 weeks later, said, look, I've got a job. I'm employed. Here's my gun. Take it. And he said that's the kind of experiences he had. A lot of those folks are desperate. They can't get a place to live. They can't get a place to work. They've got, you pointed out, they own child support, so we took away, and I voted to take away license. Thought it was a good thing. Had no idea that I'd be taking away an individual's ability to get to work, to pay, their child support. And a lot of times in legislation, unintended consequences come back to bite us tremendously. And I think it's done on a lot of those things. I'll close with that. Thank you all for the opportunity to come and make a difference in the future, please. Okay.